If you are waiting for inspiration to change your life, then you are already stuck, not because you are weak, but because you have placed control in emotions that will always betray you. Your life today is not decided by the motivation you have, but by what you do when motivation is absent. And if you are brave enough to listen to this story until the end, you will realize a truth that may feel uncomfortable, yet is exactly what can pull you out of the exhausting loop of delay and set you on a completely different trajectory for your life. Life does not change when you wait to feel better. It changes when you act while the emotions are still heavy. Many people believe they will begin when they are ready, when motivation appears, when their mental state is high enough. That belief sounds reasonable, but it is exactly what keeps you stuck. Every day spent waiting is a day you hand control over to circumstances, not because you lack ability, but because you place decision-making power in emotions that constantly change. The truth is that emotion follows action, not the other way around. When you do the right thing, even when you do not feel like it, you send a powerful signal inward that you are the one at the wheel. From that moment, order begins to form. Discipline is not harsh force. It is structure that keeps you from being swept away. Without structure, life is driven by scattered impulses and easy choices. You may not notice the consequences immediately, but time will accumulate everything. Every time you delay an important task, you teach your brain that avoidance is safe. Every time you choose comfort over what is right, you reinforce an invisible habit. That habit is quiet, but it silently shapes who you become. Discipline appears as a clear boundary between short-term desire and long-term goals. It does not wait for you to like it. It requires you to show up on time, when the alarm rings, when difficult work must begin, when fatigue arrives. That is where discipline is born, not on the stage of inspiration, but in the quiet room where no one is watching. You do not need to change everything today. You need a decision clear enough to cut through the waiting loop. A decision to stand up before the mind begins to negotiate. A decision to take one small step and take it now. That small step has power because it breaks inertia. Inertia is the greatest prison of the adult human being. When you break inertia, you create momentum. This momentum does not come from emotional highs, but from silent consistency. Discipline, therefore, is not the enemy of freedom. It is the condition that allows freedom to exist. Freedom is not doing whatever you want whenever you want. It is the ability to do what must be done even when you do not want to. When you grasp this truth, you stop searching for motivation. You begin building systems. And from those systems, life begins to change direction. Not when a major failure happens, but when you begin negotiating with ease. Negotiation sounds harmless, but it is the first doorway to drifting. You tell yourself that today you are tired, so you should rest a little, that tomorrow will not be too late, that breaking discipline once does not matter. These statements do not knock you down immediately, but they establish a precedent. Once a precedent exists, the brain remembers that standards can be adjusted. And when standards are adjusted repeatedly, they are no longer standards, they become momentary emotions. From here, life begins to move by inertia. You still wake up, still go to work, still fulfill surface responsibilities, but inside there is a quiet retreat. You are no longer moving forward, you are only keeping things from collapsing. Ease often disguises itself as self-compassion. You say that you need rest, that you deserve comfort, that there has already been enough pressure. But there is a very thin line between conscious rest and systematic avoidance. When comfort becomes the first reflex, whenever discomfort appears, you are training yourself to turn away from growth. No one tells you this, because it is not easy to hear. But the truth is that every time you choose what is easy instead of what is right, you teach the brain that you are not reliable. You know what needs to be done, but you do not do it. The gap between knowing and doing is where self-respect is eroded. It does not collapse in one day. It is worn down through hundreds of small choices. When this continues, you begin to doubt yourself. You no longer believe that you will follow through to the end. You start setting lower goals, not because you lack ability, but because you no longer trust your own endurance. This is the real cost of ease. It takes away inner belief, and when belief is gone, motivation cannot survive for long. Drifting, therefore, is not doing nothing. It is doing just enough to exist, but not enough to change. You are busy but not progressing. You are tired but not proud. You try, but without momentum. In this state, you are easily pulled toward quick solutions, instant promises, short-term pleasures. All of them give you the feeling that you are doing something, while in reality you are avoiding what matters. The most dangerous thing is that this drifting does not hurt right away. It lulls you. It makes you accustomed to a lower version of yourself. And once accustomed, you begin to defend it. You rationalize. You compare yourself to those doing worse to feel fine. You tell yourself that everyone is like this. But deep inside, there is a small voice that does not go silent. It reminds you of who you could become if you did not compromise. That voice does not disappear. It is only covered by the noise of busyness and entertainment. When night falls, when everything is quiet, you feel very clearly the distance between where you are and where you know you should be. This distance creates a low burning pressure. If you avoid it, it turns into prolonged fatigue. If you face it, it becomes real motivation. Most people choose avoidance because facing it requires action. But it is exactly here that the story begins to shift. Realizing that ease is not a reward but a trap is the first step out. You do not need to punish yourself for slipping. You need to end negotiation. Discipline does not begin with big actions, but with one very clear principle. Do not bargain with what you know is right. When this principle is set, life begins to have boundaries. And boundaries are the only thing that prevent human beings from drifting. Laziness does not appear with an obvious negative image. It is not always lying still and doing nothing. It often wears very reasonable forms. Scrolling a little longer to relax, doing small tasks to avoid the big one, preparing more to feel more certain. All of these behaviors create the illusion of progress, while in reality you are standing still. Disguised laziness works by blurring the line between action and avoidance. It does not tell you to stop. It tells you to slow down. And it is this slowing that steals the future. When you slow down long enough, you lose rhythm. When rhythm is lost, everything becomes heavier. Actions that were once simple now require more energy to begin. You start to feel that everything is difficult, when in truth, the hardest part is the moment of starting. Laziness understands this mechanism very well. It knows that if it can delay the first few minutes, it can win the entire day. That is why it does not attack with big temptations. It attacks with very small choices. 5 more minutes in bed, 1 more round of checking the phone, 1 more reason to postpone a decision. Each of these small choices does not cause immediate damage, but they accumulate. And this accumulation creates a trajectory. That trajectory does not lead you to obvious failure. It leads you to a dimmer version of yourself. You still live, still work, still fulfill roles, but you no longer feel that you are moving forward. You feel like you are running on a treadmill, tired, but going nowhere. The most dangerous part is that the brain begins to adapt to this state. It treats low energy as normal. It treats low standards as safe. At that point, any demand that requires more effort is seen as a threat. You begin to avoid challenges not because you cannot handle them, but because you are no longer accustomed to tension. Laziness at this stage is no longer a behavior. It becomes a system that protects comfort at all costs. And this system is very sophisticated. It uses reasoning. It uses comparison. It uses stories about circumstances to justify itself. But regardless of the form, the result is the same. You do not show up on time for your own life. Every day you do not do the most important thing is a day the future is eroded. You may not see the consequence immediately, but your future feels it very clearly. Time does not judge, it only records, and it accumulates. When you look back, you do not see one big mistake. You see a chain of moments where you did not stand up when you needed to. This is how laziness steals the future, not with a punch, but with sedation. The only way to break it is not to wait for stronger motivation, but to look directly at this mechanism. When you name it correctly, it loses power. When you realize that every time you delay, you are reinforcing a system against yourself, you begin to change how you respond. You no longer ask yourself whether you feel like doing it. You ask whether this moves you forward. That question cuts away excess emotion. It brings you back to the role of the driver. Laziness cannot exist when you act immediately at the first moment. It needs time to build reasons. When you do not give it time, it has no place to stand. Therefore, the focus is not on defeating laziness in one big battle, but on not letting it begin. Stand up the moment the intention appears. Start before the brain has time to construct a story. This action may seem small, but it is decisive. It breaks the chain. It restores rhythm. And rhythm is the foundation of all long-term progress. When rhythm is restored, you do not need to force yourself as much as before. Everything becomes lighter, not because it is easier, but because you are no longer dragging old inertia. From here, the invisible enemy loses its greatest advantage. You are no longer led in the dark. You begin to see clearly that the future is not taken away in one day, but in small moments. And it is also in those small moments that you can take back control. This breaking point does not appear as an obvious failure, but forms when action is gradually replaced by rationalized delay. You do not say that you are quitting. You say that you are preparing. You do not say that you are avoiding. You say that you need more information. Each time you do this, you create a safety cushion for the ego, while the truth is that you are retreating. Rationalized delay is the most sophisticated mechanism because it allows you to feel like a responsible person. You still think, you still plan, you still talk about goals. But you do not do what needs to be done at the moment it needs to be done. The gap between intention and action begins to stretch, and it is this gap that drains energy. The longer it lasts, the heavier action becomes. The brain begins to associate action with tension. It learns that starting is hard. At that point, you need more effort just to initiate. This is how the breaking point is created, not because you are weak, but because you have allowed that gap to grow each day. Rationalized delay often speaks in a very convincing voice. It reminds you of circumstances, of pressure, of accumulated fatigue. It compares you with others who are also slowing down. It tells you that you are not alone. But the truth is that everyone pays a personal price for their choices, and your price is not paid immediately. It is recorded. As time passes, you begin to feel a heaviness that is hard to name. You do not lack ability, but you lack momentum. You do not lack understanding, but you lack consistency. You begin to wonder why nothing is progressing even though you think so much. That doubt turns back on you and makes you even more cautious. The more cautious you become, the more you delay. The loop closes. This is the silent breaking point. It does not cause collapse, but it keeps you standing still. And standing still in a moving world is a form of falling behind. When action is replaced by rationalized delay, your identity also begins to shift. You no longer see yourself as a person of action, but as a person of thought. You measure yourself by intention rather than results. This lowers internal standards. You accept that knowing is enough, even though deep inside you understand that knowing without doing does not create change. Each time you accept this, you blur the boundary between who you want to become and who you are living as. When that boundary blurs, returning becomes harder, not because the path disappears, but because you no longer see it clearly. This breaking point also distorts the meaning of rest. True rest restores you, so you can act again. But rationalized delay borrows the name of rest to avoid action. You rest, but you do not recover. You stop, but you do not regenerate energy. The result is prolonged fatigue. The more tired you feel, the more you believe you need to stop. The loop continues. The only way to break this point is not to force yourself to do more, but to restore the direct link between intention and action. When intention appears, action must follow immediately with a very small step. It does not need to be perfect. It does not need to be enough. It only needs to begin. Beginning is the strongest action against delay. It narrows the gap. It sends a signal that you keep your word to yourself. Each time you do this, you repair the breaking point. You do not need to repair everything at once. You only need to repair moment by moment. One moment of standing up when you want to stay. One moment of opening the document when you want to check your phone. One moment of starting when you want to wait longer. These moments are not celebrated on social media, but they are the real foundation. When you accumulate enough moments of keeping your word, the gap between intention and action shrinks. Action becomes lighter. The brain relearns that starting is not dangerous. Then energy returns. Not emotional energy, but structural energy. You no longer need to ask yourself whether you want to. You act because the rhythm has been established. The silent breaking point loses its influence as rhythm is restored. You no longer need to fight big battles. You only need to not give delay a chance to speak. And when action returns to the center, life begins to take a clearer shape. You are no longer vaguely busy. You begin to see results, even if small. These results restore belief. Belief brings real motivation. And from here, the story prepares to enter a turning phase where action is no longer a random reaction, but becomes a guiding principle. This is the moment you understand that action does not wait for motivation. Action creates motivation. This realization is not emotionally stimulating. It is structural. When you wait for inspiration, you place control in something unstable. When you act first, you take the wheel back. This shift changes how you see everything difficult. Before, difficulty meant needing more time. Now, difficulty means needing to start earlier. You no longer ask when you will be ready. You ask what is the smallest step you can take right now. This question cuts through ambiguity and pulls you back into the present. Small action has a power that big thinking does not have. It creates evidence. Evidence that you can show up even when you do not want to. When evidence appears, the brain updates belief. This new belief is not based on hope, it is based on experience. You begin to see that energy is not something you need beforehand. It is something that is generated along the way. Every time you begin, you start the engine inside. At first, the engine runs slowly. But it runs. And when it runs, momentum appears. Momentum does not come from emotional peaks. It comes from uninterrupted continuity. This is the core of the turning point. Not doing more, but doing earlier. Not doing perfectly, but doing now. When you act before the brain has time to build reasons, you break the power of delay. Delay lives on stories. Action lives on movement. Movement does not need debate. It only needs to begin. In this phase, you learn to treat initial discomfort as a signal of the right direction, not a warning to stop. The heavy feeling at the start is no longer proof that you are wrong. It is proof that you are entering the growth zone. This change is subtle, but it reverses the entire frame of reference. Before, you searched for a good feeling in order to act. Now, you accept discomfort in order to become better. This does not make you rigid, it makes you freer, because you are no longer led by temporary states. You lead by principle. This principle is very simple. When something important appears, action must immediately follow with a concrete step. That step can be small, but it must be real. Write a paragraph. Open a page. Stand up and move. Send a necessary message. These actions do not need perfect conditions. They need instant decisiveness. When you repeat this decisiveness, the brain begins to believe that your decisions carry weight. This belief changes how you talk to yourself. You no longer need long persuasion. You give short commands and execute. This reduces inner friction. Less debate means less drain. You save energy for doing instead of thinking. The cognitive turning point also reveals another truth. Motivation arrives late, but it arrives steady. When you act even when you do not want to, something strange happens. After a few minutes, resistance decreases. The mind shifts from opposition to cooperation. You begin to focus. Focus creates progress. Progress creates real motivation. This motivation is not loud, but it is solid. It does not depend on circumstances. It depends on the chain of actions you have taken. As this chain grows longer, motivation becomes a natural consequence. You do not need to search for it. It comes to you as a reward for consistency. At this turning point, you also realize that waiting is a socially accepted form of delay. Many people wait for better conditions and call it caution. But caution does not exclude action. True caution is structured action. You begin to design actions so that risk is low, but rhythm is high. You do not need to give everything at once. You need to show up every day. Consistent presence is stronger than short-term bursts. When you show up continuously, you send a clear message to the future that you are building a foundation. This foundation is not based on emotion. It is based on schedule and commitment. Commitment to yourself is the hardest form of commitment because there is no audience. But precisely because there is no audience, it is real. Every time you keep your word in silence, you reinforce your inner axis. This axis helps you stand firm when pressure increases. The cognitive turning point, therefore, is not the moment you feel strong. It is the moment you stop waiting to feel strong in order to begin. From here, the story turns toward construction, no longer fighting laziness emotionally, but designing a system where action happens before thought can interfere. You do not need to believe that you will always be motivated. You only need to believe that you will act according to the principle you have chosen. This principle is simple, but not easy. It requires you to accept initial discomfort many times, but each time you accept it, you receive something greater. Quiet confidence. Confidence that comes from knowing that you can begin at any time. And when you know this, you no longer fear low days. You no longer fear emotional drops, because you already have a clear path to continue. Action before motivation is not just an idea. It is the axis that changes the entire way you live and work. When this axis is set correctly, every other part begins to align, and from here, the story moves into the next stage, where discipline is no longer an abstract concept, but becomes a reflexive system built step by step. Once you understand that action comes before motivation, the next question is no longer why you should act, but how to make action happen consistently, even when the mind resists. The answer lies in reducing friction and increasing automation. The human brain does not like making complex decisions over and over. Every decision consumes energy. When you force yourself to decide each day whether to act or not, you place the burden on willpower. Willpower is limited, systems are not. A good system turns action into a reflex. A reflex does not need debate. It happens because the conditions are set. To build this system, you do not start with big goals, but with small actions that are clear, specific, easy enough to begin, yet meaningful enough to create momentum. Small action is not a compromise with laziness. It is a strategy to cross the activation threshold. The activation threshold is the greatest barrier. Once you cross it, the rest becomes lighter. That is why a disciplined system begins by shortening the distance between intention and action. You place action immediately after a signal. Waking up is the signal. Standing up is the action. Opening the computer is the signal. Typing the first line is the action. When signal and action are paired repeatedly, the brain learns that there is no need to think much. It simply executes. This is how reflexes are formed. This system requires three clear elements. First, a fixed signal. Second, a minimum non-negotiable action. Third, a clear ending so the brain recognizes completion. When these three elements remain stable, discipline no longer depends on emotion. It relies on structure. Structure creates safety. Safety allows you to show up even when you are tired. Many people think discipline makes life rigid, but in reality, it makes life lighter because you are no longer in constant inner conflict. Less conflict means more energy for what truly matters. A reflex system also helps you escape the burst trap. Many people only act when inspiration is strong. They do a lot for a short time, then burn out. This cycle creates the illusion of progress, but it is not sustainable. A reflex system chooses a small, steady rhythm. This rhythm does not impress, but it accumulates. Accumulation is what creates real difference. When small actions are repeated daily, they begin to shape identity. You are no longer someone who is trying, you are someone with habits. Habits free you from having to prove yourself every day. You simply show up and follow the rhythm. What matters is that the small action is protected as a principle. No negotiation, no switching, no postponing. If you allow negotiation with the small action, you break the system. Systems live on consistency. Consistency creates belief. Belief creates strength. In this phase, you learn to design your environment to support reflexes. You place what you need within reach. You remove distractions from the starting space. You do not rely on inner strength to fight temptation. You use external structure to reduce temptation from the start. This is not weakness. This is intelligence. People who endure over the long term do not win by always being strong. They win by having to fight less. A reflex system also teaches an important lesson about failure. When you slip for one day, you do not collapse because you know the system is still there. You return to the rhythm the next day. No self-blame, no exaggeration, no quitting. The system does not demand perfection. It demands return. Every time you return, you reinforce the belief that one bad day does not define who you are. Long chains define you. This creates calm. Calm allows you to go far. When the reflex system is running, you begin to feel a subtle change. You no longer need to talk to yourself much. You act first and think later. You are less pulled into inner debate. When debate decreases, speed increases. Speed does not mean moving faster. It means starting earlier each day. Starting earlier creates space. Space allows adjustment. Adjustment allows improvement. This is a healthy loop. A reflex system also helps you clearly distinguish between effort and tension. Effort is focused movement with direction. Tension is resistance. When action becomes reflexive, effort increases while tension decreases. You do more work but feel less tired because you are no longer dragging resistance along. This shift is crucial for mature audiences balancing many roles. You do not need more pressure. You need better structure. This structure is not complex. It is simple but strict. Strict with small things. When you are strict with small things, you do not need to be harsh with big ones. Big results arrive through accumulation. Part 6, therefore, lays the foundation for the entire path ahead. Discipline is no longer a slogan. It is a chain of intentionally designed reflexes. This chain protects you on low days. It carries you forward when emotions fluctuate. It turns progress into a natural consequence. Once this system is formed, you no longer ask how to have discipline. You simply maintain the rhythm. And when the rhythm is held long enough, discipline is no longer something you strain to keep. It becomes how you operate. From here, the story is ready to move into the next layer, where hesitation is cut at the very first moment, and the power of immediate action is brought to the center. The first moment of hesitation. Hesitation does not last long. It is often only a few seconds. But those few seconds determine the direction of the entire chain of actions that follows. When hesitation appears, the brain begins to build a story. The story always sounds reasonable. It can be done later. Prepare a bit more to be safe. Rest for a moment, and then start. These sentences are not meant to convince you to quit completely. They only need you to slow down. And when you slow down, control shifts from principle to emotion. Most people do not lose because they are weak, but because they allow hesitation to exist long enough. Hesitation needs time to grow. If you cut it the moment it appears, it has no chance to develop. That is why the central principle of this phase is immediate action, not big action, but the first action. The first action functions like a switch. When the switch is turned on, the rest can unfold. When the switch is not turned on, the entire system stays still. You do not need to complete the whole task. You only need to flip the switch, open the document, stand up from the chair, start counting your breath, write the first line. This first action must happen before the brain has time to argue. Argument is the territory of delay. Action is the territory of control. When you act first, you place yourself back in the role of the leader. Cutting hesitation is not forcing emotion. It is deciding not to give emotion veto power. Emotion can follow later, but it does not get the driver's seat. When you apply this principle repeatedly, something interesting happens. Hesitation begins to appear less often, not because it disappears, but because the brain learns that it is no longer listened to. When a signal is repeatedly ignored, it loses weight. This is how you retrain reflexes. Before, hesitation led to delay. Now, hesitation leads to action. The brain updates a new connection. This connection creates speed. Speed does not mean moving faster. It means not getting stuck at the starting point. When you are not stuck at the starting point, the whole day has a different rhythm. You do not carry the heavy feeling of not having begun. You do not waste energy on self-blame. Energy is preserved for actual work. What matters is that you do not need to feel confident to cut hesitation. You only need commitment to the principle. When the signal appears, action follows immediately. This commitment is simple but strict. It allows no exceptions, because exceptions break reflexes. The moment you allow negotiation with hesitation, you teach the brain that argument is useful, and argument is fertile ground for delay. Cutting hesitation also requires accepting short-term discomfort. This discomfort usually lasts only a few minutes, but many people avoid it at all costs. They do not realize that avoiding a few minutes of discomfort trades for many hours of heaviness later. When you cut hesitation and start immediately, you exchange a few minutes of discomfort for longer relief. This relief does not come from completion. It comes from knowing you are moving in the right direction. The brain likes movement. It does not like suspension. When you begin, you release that suspension. Another important element in this phase is clarity. You must know what the first action is before hesitation appears. If you do not define it in advance, the brain will fill the gap with delay. That is why you need to prepare the first action ahead of time. When the day begins, you do not ask yourself what to do. You already know. This clarity significantly reduces hesitation. You do not give the brain a chance to choose among multiple options. You provide a single path. That path may be small, but it places you on the correct trajectory. Once the trajectory is set, all later adjustments become easier. Cutting hesitation also changes how you view strength. Strength is not found in always feeling determined. It lies in the ability to not let emotion delay action. When you can do this, you no longer fear low days. You know that regardless of how the day feels, you can still flip the switch, and once the switch is on, the whole system runs. This creates a very different kind of confidence. Quiet, unshowy, but durable. You no longer have to persuade yourself every morning. You only need to remember one principle. Do not let hesitation have a voice. Every time you live by this principle, you reinforce the identity of a person who acts. This identity is not formed from thought, but from a chain of small, repeated choices. When this chain becomes long enough, you no longer need much effort to cut hesitation. It becomes a reflex. Part 7 therefore serves as the bridge between system and inner strength. The system gives you structure. Cutting hesitation gives you speed. When structure and speed meet, discipline moves to a new level. No longer heavy, no longer forced, only clarity and continuous movement. And from this foundation, the story is ready to go deeper into the next layer, where the way you talk to yourself becomes the most powerful control tool for action and endurance. Not circumstances, not ability, but the inner voice decides whether you get up or stay where you are. This voice operates constantly. It interprets sensation. It assigns meaning to discomfort. It gives commands or asks for permission. Most people let this voice run freely and then wonder why they lack discipline. When the voice is soft, action becomes heavy. When the voice is clear, action becomes simple. That is why the focus of this stage is shifting from emotional self-talk to inner leadership command. Emotional self-talk revolves around feelings. Too tired, not in the mood. Later, inner leadership command revolves around short, concrete, non-negotiable instructions. Stand up, begin, complete the first step. The difference is not in content, but in structure. Emotional self-talk opens debate. Inner leadership command closes debate. When debate is closed, energy is preserved. You do not waste energy persuading yourself. You move straight into execution. This does not make you cold. It makes you clear. Clarity is the foundation of endurance. To build a leadership voice, you need to change 3 habits. First is how you ask questions. Open questions activate emotion. Do you feel like doing it? Do you have enough energy? These questions give power to temporary states. Replace them with action questions. What is the next step? What is the minimum action? How long will I do it? Action questions narrow the field and pull you into motion. Second is the length of commands. Long internal dialogue creates friction. The shorter the command, the easier it is to execute. The brain responds better to simple instructions. Stand up, open the document, write for 10 minutes. When commands are short, the brain has no space to escape. Third is tone. Tone is not yelling. It is calm decisiveness. No motivation, no explanation, just clarity. This calm tone sends a signal of safety. The brain does not feel attacked, so resistance is lower. Many people think they need encouragement to get things done, but encouragement often comes with negotiation. Inner leadership does not negotiate. It does not require high emotion. It requires clear decision. When you apply these 3 changes, the inner voice begins to shift roles from narrator to commander. This shift has more impact than any external motivation because it happens at the exact moment before action. When the leadership voice speaks, action follows. And when action follows, belief is reinforced. This belief is different from emotional confidence. It is trust in your ability to execute. You trust that when you give an order, you will follow it. This trust significantly reduces tension. You are no longer afraid of decisions because you know you will not abandon yourself. The leadership voice also helps you handle small failures in a healthy way. When you miss a beat, it does not shame you. It commands a return. No long analysis, no labels, just return to the next step. This keeps the system running. Emotional self-talk, by contrast, turns one slip into a big story. That story makes you heavy and more likely to quit. Inner leadership cuts the story short and keeps action at the center. Another important aspect is how you speak about discomfort. Emotional self-talk labels discomfort as a warning sign. Inner leadership labels discomfort as a work signal. When you change the label, the brain learns that discomfort is not dangerous. It is simply the sensation that accompanies growth. This relabeling immediately reduces resistance. You do not need to like discomfort. You only need to stop treating it as a reason to stop. When discomfort loses veto power, action becomes more consistent. Inner leadership also helps you maintain personal standards. Standards are not distant goals. They are how you show up each day. When the inner voice is clear, standards are maintained without excessive effort. You do not need to remind yourself repeatedly. You simply follow familiar commands. This is especially important for adults balancing many roles. When energy is scattered, the leadership voice keeps you in rhythm. It helps you decide quickly what to do first and what to skip. Fast decisions reduce fatigue. Reduced fatigue increases endurance. Endurance creates results. One point must be emphasized. Inner leadership does not mean rigidity. It means consistency. Consistency allows flexibility elsewhere. When core actions are stable, you have room to adjust details. When the core is negotiated, you must strain everywhere. Constant strain leads to burnout. Inner leadership is therefore an energy-saving strategy. It places energy in the right place, at the right time, in the right amount. When the leadership voice becomes habitual, you notice a subtle change in how life feels. Less noise, less inner pulling, more movement. You no longer push yourself with emotion. You are pulled forward by an established rhythm. This rhythm does not come from circumstances. It comes from how you command yourself. And when you master the inner voice, you master the ignition point of all action. Part 8 is therefore a critical upgrade. Reflex systems give you structure. Cutting hesitation gives you speed. Inner leadership gives you control. When these three combine, discipline is no longer a battle. It becomes a mode of operation. From here, the story moves into the next layer, where pressure is used deliberately to pull action out of the comfort zone and keep momentum through the most difficult phases. Pressure. Most people try to avoid pressure because they associate it with stress and burnout. But pressure is not the enemy. Uncontrolled pressure is the problem. When designed correctly, pressure becomes the most powerful force that pulls action forward. Without pressure, life drifts into a floating state. Everything can be done later. When everything can be done later, very little gets done on time. Proper pressure creates time boundaries. These boundaries force you to show up. No inspiration needed. No mood required. Just being on time. When you show up on time, action happens. And when action happens, momentum is maintained. The pressure here does not come from self-punishment or unrealistic expectations. It comes from clear personal standards and commitments with consequences. Consequences do not need to be severe punishments. They only need to be real enough for the brain to take them seriously. When there are no consequences, the brain prioritizes comfort. When consequences exist, the brain prioritizes action. This is a basic survival reflex. Disciplined people do not fight this reflex. They use it. They create just enough pressure to pull themselves out of stagnation. Proper pressure begins with identifying what is non-negotiable. Not everything matters equally. There are actions that, if not done, make everything else meaningless. These are core actions. When you identify a core action, you set a non-negotiable standard for it. Not because you are tired, not because you are busy, not because of emotion. This standard does not need to be high. It needs to be clear. Clear enough to eliminate daily debate. When the standard is clear, pressure appears naturally. You do not have to force it. You know that if you do not act, you are violating yourself. This violation creates internal tension. If this tension is released through action, it turns into energy. If it is avoided, it turns into fatigue. Proper pressure is therefore pressure that is discharged through action, not accumulated in thought. Another critical element is deadlines. Deadlines are not enemies of creativity. They are conditions for creativity. Without deadlines, the brain delays starting. With deadlines, the brain focuses, Focus improves quality more than extended time. Time pressure forces prioritization. Prioritization forces elimination. Elimination clarifies what matters. This is the logic chain of progress. Adults are often stuck, not because they lack time, but because they lack boundaries. Proper pressure creates these boundaries. It states that this task must be done within this frame. No discussion. Once the frame is set, the brain adjusts behavior accordingly. You do not need more motivation. You need a frame. Another form of pressure is accountability pressure. When you only commit to yourself, negotiation is easy. When you commit to others, standards rise. Not because you fear others, but because you value honor. Accountability pressure activates the part of you that wants to keep its word. This part is powerful when used correctly. You do not need to announce every goal. You only need a few strategic commitments that are specific and measurable. When the deadline arrives, you show up not because of emotion, but because of honor. Honor creates a pull that lasts longer than motivation. Proper pressure also requires distinguishing between useless stress and directed pressure. Useless stress comes from trying to do too many things at once. Directed pressure comes from choosing one key task and placing full effort on it within a clear frame. When you choose the right focus, pressure becomes concentrated. Concentration makes effort more effective. Effectiveness produces results. Results rebuild belief. Belief allows you to withstand the next round of pressure. This is the growth loop. In this phase, you also learn to place pressure on behavior rather than outcomes. Outcomes are influenced by many factors. Behavior is within control. When you place pressure on showing up on time and completing the committed step, you maintain psychological stability. You are not shaken by external fluctuation. This stability is essential for long journeys. Behavioral pressure creates the identity of someone reliable. This identity is stronger than any goal. Another crucial point is that pressure must be paired with recovery. Pressure without recovery leads to burnout. Recovery without pressure leads to stagnation. These two must be balanced. Disciplined people do not rest to escape. They rest to continue. Structured rest is part of the pressure system. When you know you will rest at a scheduled time, you do not need to break standards while working. This keeps rhythm stable. Stable rhythm builds endurance. Endurance allows you to survive prolonged, difficult phases. Proper pressure also teaches a lesson in maturity. You do not wait for someone to push you. You set standards and take responsibility yourself. This changes how you see yourself. You are no longer reactive. You are a designer. When you design pressure, you do not fear it. You use it as a tool. This tool does not make you smaller, it makes you sharper. Part 9 is therefore a critical transition where discipline becomes tied to personal standards and responsibility. Action no longer depends on mood. It is pulled by deliberately designed pressure structures. When these structures are set correctly, you do not need to push yourself every day. You simply step into the frame you have created, and that frame carries you forward even when everything feels heavy. From this foundation, the story is ready to move into the next layer, where the ability to stay with discomfort is trained to build the mental hardness required for long-term growth. No matter how good a system is, it will eventually be tested. Long stretches of fatigue, periods with no visible results, moments when pressure piles on top of pressure. This is where mental hardness is formed. Hardness is not blind endurance. It is the ability not to retreat when discomfort appears. Most people are taught that discomfort is a signal to avoid. But in long-term growth, discomfort is a signal that you are moving in the right direction. When you avoid discomfort, you avoid the very process that builds capacity. That is why the focus of this phase is changing your relationship with discomfort, not fighting it, not escaping it, staying with it, staying long enough for it to lose control. Discomfort is strongest at the moment of starting. If you stay through the first few minutes, its intensity drops. This is a physiological rule. the brain reacts strongly to change. Once the change has occurred, the brain adjusts. So, if you get through the first few minutes, you have already won the hardest part. Undisciplined people retreat at the peak of discomfort. Enduring people move through that peak. No heroics required. Just do not retreat. Mental hardness is built through very small choices repeated over time. Choosing to continue for a few more minutes. Choosing to complete one more step. Choosing not to relieve discomfort immediately. These choices send a powerful message to the nervous system that discomfort is not a threat. When this message is repeated, the brain reduces its alarm response. Work becomes lighter, not because it is easier, but because you are no longer fighting the initial sensation. At this stage, many people make a subtle mistake. They try to eliminate discomfort by changing the goal or making everything excessively easy. This may help short-term, but it weakens hardness. Hardness requires the right amount of resistance, not so much that it breaks you, not so little that no adaptation occurs. Proper resistance is where effort is required but control remains. You feel strain, but not overload. When you stay in this zone long enough, you grow stronger in a sustainable way. Mental hardness is also connected to how you seek relief. Many people seek relief as soon as discomfort appears. They look for quick comfort to shut the feeling down. But immediate relief teaches the brain that discomfort must be avoided at all costs. Next time, the brain reacts even more strongly. When you delay relief and complete the task first, the brain learns that discomfort is tolerable. This learning is critical. It expands tolerance. Higher tolerance allows you to do harder work for longer periods. This is the foundation of real achievement. Mental hardness is not built in moments of glory. It is built on ordinary mornings when you act without enthusiasm. It is built on days of faint results when you still keep the rhythm. Each such day adds a layer of steel inside. This steel does not make you rigid, it makes you stable. Stability is rare in a world full of distraction. Stability allows you to go farther than those who rely on emotion. Another important aspect is distinguishing between good pain and bad pain. Good pain comes from directed effort. It is tiring but clean. Afterward, you feel clarity. Bad pain comes from avoidance and self-blame. It is heavy and lingering. When you avoid what needs to be done, you do not avoid pain. You only change the type of pain. Mental hardness is the ability to choose good pain over bad pain, to choose limited pain now to avoid prolonged pain later. When you understand this, choices become clearer. You do not ask whether you are comfortable. You ask whether this pain moves you forward. That question returns you to the role of the leader. Staying with discomfort also requires adjusting expectations. You do not demand high performance every day. You demand consistent presence. Some days are strong. Some days are just enough. But no day is abandoned completely. This rule keeps rhythm unbroken. Unbroken rhythm preserves momentum. Preserved momentum allows real motivation to appear. Mental hardness is not doing more every day. It is not quitting on low days. This is the difference between those who go far and those who stop halfway. When you stay with discomfort long enough, a subtle shift occurs. You begin to trust your ability to endure. This trust does not come from positive thinking. It comes from direct experience. You stayed. You passed through. You did not break. Each such experience builds quiet confidence. This confidence does not need proof. It simply exists. And when it exists, you no longer fear difficult phases. You know you can move through them. This releases a great deal of mental energy. You no longer have to defend yourself from the future. You focus on the present. The present is where action happens. Mental hardness also clarifies the boundary between discipline and punishment. Discipline is not meant to make you suffer. It is meant to free you from being pulled by emotion. When you stay with discomfort, you are not punishing yourself. You are investing in future capacity. Every minute you stay is an investment. This investment pays interest in the form of endurance. Endurance allows you to pursue long-term goals without constant motivation. Part 10 is therefore the core training step. The system is in place, speed is in place, inner leadership is in place, pressure is correctly set. Now it is time to forge the person who can operate all of this under unfavorable conditions. When you develop the ability to stay with discomfort, discipline is no longer fragile. It does not collapse in headwinds, it stands firm. And from that firmness, the story is ready to move into the next layer, where immediate impulses are governed by long-term perspective to protect your energy and direction. Impulse does not ask for permission. It appears quickly. It promises instant comfort, and it demands action right now. In that moment, the future is obscured. The brain sees only the near reward. If you do not have a mechanism to manage impulse, every system built before will be pierced. That is why the focus here is not eliminating impulse, but creating a pause long enough for you to choose again. Impulse is strongest in the first few seconds. If you act immediately, you are carried away. If you can create a very short pause, control returns. This pause does not need to be long. It only needs to be enough to activate long-term thinking. The simplest method is deliberate delay, not saying never, just saying not now. When you delay for a few minutes, impulse begins to lose intensity. The brain shifts from reflex mode to evaluation mode. This is the golden window. In this window, you introduce long-term perspective. You ask where this choice leads in 1 hour, 1 day, 1 month. No complex analysis is needed, just clear visualization. Visualization is the language the brain understands. When you clearly see the long-term cost, short-term attraction weakens. This is not suppression. This is changing weight. You make the future heavier than the present. Impulse management also requires recognizing vulnerable states. When hungry, tired, lonely, stressed, impulse is stronger. This is physiological, not moral. Disciplined people do not shame themselves when impulse appears. They prepare in advance. They eat enough. They sleep enough. They reduce exposure to stimulation during weak periods. This preparation is not weakness. It is strategy. When physiological foundations are stable, you have more capacity to choose well. Another important strategy is substitution. Impulse needs an outlet. If you only block without replacing, you create rebound pressure. Instead, you prepare a replacement action that is less harmful but still releases energy. A short walk, deep breathing, writing thoughts down, starting a small part of the task. When the brain has an alternative, impulse loses its pull. Over time, the brain learns that not all tension needs to be released through instant reward. This increases self-regulation capacity. This capacity is critical for adults living in high-stimulation environments. Impulse management is also directly connected to how you consume information. Continuous short content trains the brain to seek fast reward. When the brain becomes accustomed to fast reward, sustained focus becomes harder. That is why protecting attention is part of impulse management. You cannot expect deep focus if you constantly feed the brain intense stimulation. Disciplined people design their information diet. They select, they limit, they create gaps. These gaps are not emptiness. They restore deep focus capacity. When deep focus returns, impulse loses its advantage. You are no longer pulled away from important work by small calls. Another key point is honesty with yourself. Impulse often disguises itself as deserved reward. You say you have done enough, that you need to relax. But if you look directly, you know the difference between real rest and avoidance. Real rest restores. Avoidance leaves emptiness. When you can distinguish the two, choices become clearer. You do not need prohibition. You simply choose what restores instead of what makes you heavier. Managing impulse does not turn you rigid. It allows you to enjoy reward at the right time. Reward after action tastes different. It carries no guilt. It does not break rhythm. It reinforces correct behavior. When you reward yourself after completion, You teach the brain that effort leads to comfort. This is the association you want to build, not comfort leading to stagnation. This association makes discipline more durable over time. Another important point is not accumulating impulse. When you constantly suppress without intentional release, pressure finds unexpected exits. That is why impulse management includes scheduling healthy release. When you know you will rest at the right time, you are less tempted to break rhythm during work. This returns to the principle of balanced pressure and recovery. Enduring people do not live in suppression. They live in structure. Structure allows freedom in the right places. When you master impulse, you master energy. Energy no longer leaks into meaningless small choices. It is reserved for high-impact work. This is the difference between those who are always busy and those who truly progress. Part 11 is therefore a critical protective layer. It shields the system from fast attacks. It keeps rhythm from being broken by instant pleasure. When you can create pause, see long-term, and choose replacement, impulse no longer dominates. It becomes just a signal, and you decide the response. From this foundation, the story is ready to move into the next layer, where energy and attention are deliberately protected so that all effort is directed toward what truly matters and produces lasting transformation. Many people work hard but do not go far because their energy is scattered and their attention is eroded. They do not lack discipline. They lack deliberate focus. When energy is divided across too many directions, no direction has enough force to create transformation. That is why this phase focuses on eliminating false productivity and concentrating effort on what truly matters. False productivity is the feeling of being busy without making progress, answering many messages, rearranging unnecessary things, doing easy tasks to avoid hard ones. These activities give you the feeling of working, but they do not move you forward. They consume energy without creating momentum. When the day ends, you are tired without proportional results. This fatigue is dangerous because it convinces you that you have tried enough. From there, you allow yourself to loosen standards on the most important work. To escape this trap, you need a very clear criterion to evaluate the value of an action. If this action is done, does it change the trajectory? If the answer is no, it should be done later or not at all. This criterion cuts away many things that seem necessary. When you cut away, you release energy. Released energy must be concentrated into one point important enough that when it moves forward, it pulls everything else with it. This is the leverage principle. Not doing more, but doing in the right place. Disciplined people understand that attention is the scarcest resource. When attention is fragmented, discipline becomes heavy. When attention is consolidated, discipline becomes light. That is why you must protect the highest energy time blocks of the day. No distractions allowed. No secondary tasks allowed to intrude. In these blocks, you do the most important work first. Not because it is easy, but because it is worthy. Doing important work first creates a sense of agency. This feeling carries through the rest of the day. You are not being chased, you are leading. Protecting energy also means saying no to misaligned requests, saying no to excessive information consumption, saying no to pleasing everyone. Every time you say no, you retain a portion of energy. This retained energy accumulates. When it accumulates enough, you have the strength to go deep. Depth creates quality. Quality creates results. Results reinforce belief. This is a sustainable chain. Another critical aspect is rest rhythm. Unstructured rest causes energy to leak. Structured rest restores. When you clearly know when you will rest, you do not break rhythm while working. You work deeper because you trust that recovery will come at the right time. This reduces impulse for premature relief. Protecting attention also requires environment design. A cluttered environment creates excess decisions. Excess decisions drain energy. When the environment is clean, the brain focuses better. You do not need willpower to fight distraction if distraction is not present. This is the principle of design instead of resistance. Enduring people design environments where correct behavior becomes easy. One key point is distinguishing between urgent and important. Urgent shouts, important is quiet. If you only respond to shouting, you miss what shapes the future. That is why every day needs a quiet block reserved for important work. This block is non-negotiable. When you keep this block consistently, you are investing in the future in the strongest way. Protecting energy is not doing less, it is doing deeper. Doing deeper requires accepting missing out. You cannot be everywhere, you cannot respond to everything, but you can create a few meaningful results. And these few results are worth far more than hundreds of trivial tasks. When you focus on what matters, you also learn to tolerate the feeling of missing out. This feeling is uncomfortable at first, but if you stay with it, you realize nothing collapses. The world continues, and you gain space to do what truly needs to be done. This space is rare. It is the competitive advantage of disciplined people. When energy and attention are protected, discipline is no longer a burden. It becomes a flow. You do not have to force yourself all day. You only need to maintain a few critical boundaries. These boundaries make everything else simpler. Part 12 is therefore a refinement step. After building systems, cutting hesitation, training hardness, and managing impulse, now is the time to remove noise. When noise is removed, focused force increases. And when focused force becomes strong enough, real transformation begins. From this foundation, the story is ready to move into the next phase, where non-negotiable action is conditioned so that disciplined rhythm becomes the daily default. This is where action no longer depends on good intentions or favorable emotions, but becomes the daily operating default. Non-negotiable does not mean rigid or emotionless. It means not opening the door to debate on core actions. When you allow debate, you allow delay. When you remove debate, you preserve rhythm. This rhythm is not about doing more. It is about doing consistently. Consistency creates stability. Stability creates long-term strength. Conditioning action begins with clearly identifying what cannot be skipped. Not a long list, just a few high-impact actions. These actions are done whether the day is good or bad, whether motivation is present or not, whether conditions are convenient or inconvenient. When you do this, you send a very clear message to yourself that some standards do not depend on state. This message creates inner self-respect. That self-respect is the foundation of real discipline. Conditioning does not happen through promises, it happens through repetition. When an action is repeated in the same time frame and the same context, the brain begins to automate it. You no longer need to decide, you only need to show up. Showing up is the hardest part. Once you show up, the rest unfolds naturally. That is why your task is not to push yourself to perform better every day, but to protect showing up. If you show up long enough, quality will improve on its own. This is a truth often overlooked. Many people try to optimize from the start. They set high expectations and then quit when they fall short. Enduring people do the opposite. They set low expectations for starting, but high expectations for repetition. Repetition beats optimization. A disciplined rhythm is built by keeping the start time fixed. When the time is fixed, the brain learns that thinking is unnecessary. When it is time, you act. This significantly reduces friction. You do not have to persuade yourself daily. You do not need to reassess. You simply follow the rhythm. This rhythm must be protected from self-created exceptions. Every exception, even a small one, sends a signal that principles can bend. When principles bend repeatedly, they lose force. That is why you must clearly distinguish between intentional flexibility and breaking rhythm. Intentional flexibility is planned in advance. Breaking rhythm is emotional reaction. When you can tell the difference, you stop deceiving yourself. Conditioning action is also about how you handle bad days. A bad day is not a reason to stop. It is a reason to simplify. You do not need to do much. You only need to keep the rhythm. Keeping rhythm on bad days is far more valuable than keeping rhythm on good days, because it reinforces the identity of someone who does not break. This identity is not formed during high moments. It is formed when you are tired and still act. Each such day adds evidence that your discipline does not depend on conditions. Conditioning also requires a fast return mechanism. When you slip, the important thing is not analyzing why, but returning as quickly as possible. The longer you wait, the more the brain learns that slipping is acceptable. When you return immediately, you teach the brain that slipping does not last. This keeps the chain intact. A long chain matters more than a perfect chain. Disciplined people do not try to keep chains unbroken. They try to keep them long. Long chains create identity. Identity creates natural behavior. When behavior becomes natural, discipline consumes far less energy. You act because this is who you are. Conditioning non-negotiable action also changes how you relate to fatigue. Fatigue is no longer a stop signal. It is a signal to adjust intensity. You can slow down. You can do less, but you do not disappear. This distinction is crucial. Many people think it is either full force or nothing. This mindset makes rhythm fragile. Enduring people accept minimum effort on low days to protect the chain. Protecting the chain matters more than performance. When the chain is preserved, you do not have to start over. You simply continue. Continuing is always easier than restarting. Another key factor is clarity about ending. When you know when a work session ends, starting becomes easier. The brain does not fear action when it knows there is a stopping point. That is why non-negotiable action needs a clear time frame, not vague extension, not working until exhaustion, just doing the defined part. When it ends, you stop. This builds trust that discipline is not punishment. It is a fair commitment. This commitment lasts because it respects limits. When you condition this rhythm, a deep change occurs. You no longer think much about discipline. You live inside it. You do not need motivation. You do not need harsh supervision. You simply move with the rhythm carved into your daily structure. This rhythm does not need to be perfect. It needs to exist. Part 13 therefore locks the system. What came before was design and training. Now it is maintenance. Maintenance is not glamorous, but it is where all results are created. When disciplined rhythm becomes default, you are no longer pulled back and forth by emotion. You have a clear path each day, and this path prepares you for the next phase, where repeated behavior merges into identity and unbreakable belief is formed from within. Here, discipline is no longer experienced as something you have to do, but as who you are becoming. This change does not happen in a dramatic moment. It happens quietly when you look back and realize that you no longer negotiate with core actions. You no longer need to push yourself. You show up by rhythm. When behavior becomes natural, inner belief changes. This new belief is not built on positive affirmations. It is built on accumulated evidence. You showed up when tired. You acted when results were not visible. You returned after slipping. Each time is evidence. Evidence stacked upon evidence creates unbreakable belief. This belief is very different from emotional confidence. It is quiet. It does not need validation. It exists because it has been tested over time. When this belief forms, the way you see difficulty changes. Difficulty is no longer a threat to the ego. It is a signal that you are operating at the correct level of growth. You no longer ask whether you are strong enough. You ask what the next step is. This question reflects a new identity, the identity of a person who acts. This identity significantly reduces inner friction. You do not need to argue much with yourself because you know you will act. This certainty frees mental energy. Freed energy returns to serve quality and creativity. When you no longer have to fight to begin, you have space to do better work. Identity integration also changes how you respond to failure. Failure is no longer interpreted as proof that you are not good enough. It is interpreted as data that shows where adjustment is needed. When you see failure as data, you are not pulled into self-blame. You maintain calm. Calm allows fast return. Fast return keeps the chain unbroken. An unbroken chain further reinforces identity. This is a powerful self-reinforcing loop. Identity also shapes the standards you accept. You no longer compromise with choices that pull you off rhythm, not because you are trying to appear disciplined, but because those choices no longer match who you have become. When identity shifts, decisions become simpler. You do not have to overthink, you choose by standard. This standard does not need to be written daily. It is carved into how you live. A clear sign of identity integration is quiet consistency. You do not need to talk much about discipline. You do not need to tell stories of struggle. You simply act, and others feel that stability. This stability creates influence. Not through words, but through presence. When you show up as reliable, others trust you. This opens new opportunities, not because you seek them, but because you are ready. Identity integration also brings a deeper kind of freedom. You are no longer pulled by temporary emotions. You can move through low days without fear of losing direction. You know that no matter how the day feels, you still have a rhythm to return to. This rhythm is home. When you have a home, you do not panic in the wind. You do not run, you stand. This steadiness reduces background anxiety. You no longer live in a state of constant self-proof. You live in steady execution. This is especially important for adults who have lived through many cycles of starting and quitting. Identity integration ends that cycle. You no longer start over, you continue. Continuation is a sign of maturity. Another subtle aspect is how you treat yourself. When the identity of a disciplined person forms, you no longer need harshness to keep yourself in line. You are fair, you are clear, you know when to push and when to recover. This fairness keeps the system sustainable. Sustainability does not come from extremes. It comes from the right rhythm maintained over time. When behavior and identity merge, you no longer feel like you are living two lives. The life you speak and the life you act become one. This unity creates a sense of wholeness. Wholeness is the foundation of peace. Peace does not come from everything being easy. It comes from trusting how you respond to difficulty. When you trust your response, you no longer fear the future. You focus on the present, and the present is where all meaningful action happens. Part 14 is therefore the stage of maturity. All techniques have been internalized. All principles are lived. What remains is not learning more, but continuing with the identity that has formed, continuing with the rhythm that has been deeply carved. And from this foundation, the story moves toward the final part, where everything is gathered into one simple and powerful life rule, strong enough to carry forward for the rest of the journey. It is not flashy, but it clearly separates a drifting life from a directed life. Life is not decided by what you understand, but by what you repeat. Everything you have just moved through was not meant to create temporary emotion. It was meant to place a stable operating axis into ordinary days, because ordinary days are what determine long-term trajectory. No explosive moment can rescue you from prolonged lack of discipline, and no small failure can destroy a person who keeps rhythm. When you view life through this lens, everything becomes clearer. You do not need to wait for a perfect day. You do not need high motivation. You need one non-negotiable rule and the courage to keep it in silence. That rule is simple. When it is time to do the important work, you show up regardless of how you feel, regardless of how yesterday turned out, regardless of whether today is convenient or difficult. You show up because that is the person you choose to become. This choice does not need to be announced. It only needs to be executed. Every time you execute it, you reinforce identity. Every time identity is reinforced, the need to push yourself decreases. life gradually shifts from struggle to operation. You no longer drag yourself through each day. You move along a rhythm that has been built. This rhythm does not remove difficulty. It gives you a way to stand steady within difficulty. When you keep this life rule, you begin to recognize a deeper form of freedom. Freedom is not doing whatever you want immediately. It is not being controlled by temporary emotion. You can be tired and still act. You can be sad and still hold direction. You can be disappointed without quitting. This is adult freedom. Freedom comes from the ability to choose response instead of reaction. Discipline, therefore, does not take life away. It returns ownership. When you control how you show up each day, you no longer live in background anxiety. You know that whatever happens, you have a way forward. That way does not depend on anyone else. It lives in the small choices you repeat. These choices do not need to be perfect. They need to be consistent. Consistency builds belief. Belief builds calm. Calm allows long sight. When you see far, you are not pulled into small fluctuations. You keep direction. This direction leads to a life that is not loud, but solid. Not easy, but meaningful. Not explosive, but progressing. The final part of the journey does not ask you to change everything right now. It asks you to choose one thing small enough to begin and important enough to keep. One non-negotiable action. One clear time frame. One commitment to yourself. When you keep it today, tomorrow becomes easier. Not because circumstances change, but because you have changed how you respond. And when response changes, life follows. No miracles needed, no secrets required. Only that you show up at the right time, repeat the right action, and trust the process even when results are not yet visible. When you do this, you no longer search for motivation. You become the person motivation comes to. And that is where this journey closes. Not with a promise, but with a very real choice, repeated every single day. You have reached the end of this journey. And if you are still here, it means that a very deep part of you is ready to live differently. What you have just heard was not a piece of temporary motivation, but a clear map showing why life does not change when you wait for feelings and why it changes when you build discipline through small actions repeated every day. You have seen that the greatest enemy is not failure, but silent drifting. That action comes before motivation. That cutting hesitation at the very first moment can change an entire trajectory. That reflex systems, inner leadership voice, properly designed pressure, the ability to stay with discomfort, impulse management, and energy protection all converge to form an unbreakable identity. Discipline does not take away freedom, it gives control back. When you show up on time, keep your word to yourself, and trust the process even when results are not yet visible, you are building a foundation that very few people have. Thank you for giving your time and attention to complete this journey. If this content gave you a new perspective or made you pause to reflect on how you are living, take one small action right now. Like this video to support the channel, share it with someone you believe needs to hear it, and subscribe to continue walking alongside stories that help you stay aligned and build a life lived with intention.